A history written in shadows, the story of espionage and codes. Prologue. The blank page that held an empire. Imagine for a moment that you are holding a completely blank piece of paper. It is unremarkable in every way, cream-colored, slightly textured, perhaps smelling faintly of pulp and nothing more. You hold it up to the light of a window, you run your fingers across its surface, you even press it to your nose to detect any hint of chemical residue. You perceive absolutely nothing. It is, by all appearances, empty and worthless. Yet, what if you were told that this very piece of paper contains the secret that could topple a kingdom, the precise location of a hidden army, the name of a traitor sitting in the highest halls of power, or the formula for a weapon that could end civilization itself? This is not the premise of a modern spy thriller. It is a scenario that has played out in the real world for thousands of years, a silent duel waged not just with swords and soldiers, but with ink, wit, patience, and the hidden meaning that lurks beneath the surface of the ordinary. The history of espionage and codes is not a niche footnote in the grand story of civilization, a collection of amusing anecdotes about clever tricks and colorful rogues. It is the shadow narrative that has always run parallel to the bright, official chronicles of kings and battles. It is the secret history, the one that explains why the battle was won before it was ever fought, why the treaty was signed on terms that seemed inexplicable, and why empires that appeared invincible suddenly crumbled into dust. Wars that fill our textbooks with dates and heroic charges were often decided not by the general with the most courage or the largest army, but by the one who had already read the enemy's battle plan. Treaties that redrew the map of the world were often negotiated by leaders who already knew the other side's absolute bottom line, because they had been secretly reading their private correspondence for months or years. This is a story that stretches back not just centuries, but millennia, to a time when the fastest way to send a message was by the aching feet of a runner, and the best way to hide a secret was not in a sophisticated algorithm, but on a man's bare, shaved scalp. This is the story of that other world, the world of the spy and the codebreaker, the world of the listener at the door and the forger of seals, and it begins far, far earlier than you might ever have imagined. Part 1. The Ancient World, where it all began. The First Information War and the Shaved Head of a Servant. To find the earliest chapters of this clandestine history, we must look far past the invention of the Internet, past the click of the telegraph key, past even the creak of the printing press. We must travel back nearly 2,500 years to the sun-baked hills of ancient Ionia, a region on the western coast of what is now Turkey, then a vibrant frontier between the sprawling Persian Empire and the fractious, independent city-states of Greece. The man we have to thank for the first recorded, detailed tricks of the spy trade is none other than the historian Herodotus, often called the father of history, and sometimes, less charitably, the father of lies. But in this particular instance, his account is so precise and so rooted in the practical realities of the time that it bears the unmistakable ring of truth. He tells a story so ingenious it almost reads as folklore, a fable of cunning, but it represents nothing less than the documented dawn of what we today call steganography, the art and science of hiding a message in plain sight so effectively that no one even suspects a message is being sent at all. The story unfolds around the year 499 BCE. A Greek nobleman named Histiaeus, the tyrant of the city of Miletus, found himself in an uncomfortable and gilded cage. He had been summoned to the court of the Persian king of kings, Darius the Great, in the imperial capital of Susa. He was, ostensibly, an honored guest and advisor. In reality, he was a hostage, a guarantee of the good behavior of his city back home. Histiaeus grew restless and ambitious. He desperately wanted to send a secret message to his son-in-law and successor in Miletus, a man named Aristagoras, urging him to launch a rebellion against their Persian overlords. The challenge was immense, and for most men, insurmountable. The Royal Road, the great highway of the Persian Empire, was patrolled constantly by mounted guards and imperial inspectors. Any messenger traveling that road, especially one heading toward the Greek cities on the restless coast, would be stopped and searched thoroughly. A hidden letter, if found, would mean a slow and agonizing death for both the messenger and eventually for Histiaeus himself. Histiaeus's solution was one of profound patience and a kind of ruthless practicality that is the hallmark of the true spy master. He summoned his most trusted personal servant, a man whose loyalty was beyond question. He ordered the man's head to be shaved completely smooth and bare. Then, with a steady hand and a sharp needle, he had a short but incendiary message tattooed directly onto the servant's exposed scalp. We do not know the exact words, but the meaning was clear. Revolt. Rise up against the Persians. The time is now. The procedure was painful and permanent. Then, the hardest part began. Histiaeus did nothing. He waited. He waited for weeks, perhaps even months, as the servant's hair slowly, agonizingly grew back. Day by day, strand by strand, the treasonous message disappeared beneath a thick, curly, and entirely unremarkable head of hair. When the hair was finally long enough to cover the tattoo completely, the servant was given a simple, innocent-sounding errand to travel back to Miletus. He looked like any other traveler on the road, dusty, tired, and carrying nothing of value. The Persian guards, if they stopped him at all, would have found nothing. He arrived at the court of Aristagoras and delivered a message that must have sounded bizarre. "Shave my head and look thereon." Aristagoras, puzzled, obeyed. The razor scraped away the hair, and there, as if by magic, was the hidden call to arms. The secret was delivered intact. The Ionian revolt was sparked, a massive uprising that would burn for 6 years and eventually draw in the city of Athens, setting in motion the chain of events that would lead to the Persian invasions of Greece and the legendary battles of Marathon, Thermopylae, and Salamis. It is not an exaggeration to say that the entire course of Western civilization was nudged onto a different path by a message hidden under a man's hair. This was far more than a clever, one-off trick. It was a fundamental recognition of a principle that would govern espionage for all the centuries to come. Controlling the flow of information is a form of power that is often more decisive than controlling territory or armies. The Persians had the world's greatest empire and the world's largest military machine, but they were blinded by a secret they never even knew was passing right under their noses. Themistocles and the lie that saved Greece. A generation after the tattooed head of Histiaeus' servant, the Greeks would master not only the art of the hidden message, but also the equally potent art of the deliberate lie. The calculated piece of misinformation designed to lead an enemy to his own destruction. This is the realm of the double agent and the strategic deception, and its first great practitioner in the historical record was the Athenian general and statesman Themistocles. The year was 480 BCE. The Persian Empire, now under the command of King Xerxes, the son of Darius, had launched a colossal invasion of Greece. This was not a punitive raid, it was an expedition of annihilation designed to absorb the stubborn Greek city-states into the Persian fold once and for all. The Persian army was the largest the world had ever seen, a vast, multilingual host drawn from every corner of the empire. The Persian navy was equally formidable, a fleet of over 1,000 warships crewed by expert Phoenician and Egyptian sailors. The Greek alliance, a fragile and often squabbling coalition of city-states led by Sparta and Athens, was vastly outnumbered. Their only hope lay in the narrow straits of water between the island of Salamis and the mainland of Attica, near Athens. In these confined waters, the sheer size and weight of the Persian fleet would become a liability, making it difficult for their ships to maneuver. The smaller, more agile Greek triremes, oared warships with a deadly bronze ram at the prow, could dart in and out, striking and retreating. But there was a problem. The Persian fleet, anchored a few miles away in the Bay of Phaleron, had no reason to enter the straits. They could simply blockade the Greeks, wait them out, and watch them starve or splinter apart from internal discord. Themistocles knew that time was his greatest enemy. He needed to provoke Xerxes into attacking immediately, on Greek terms. To do this, he did not pray to the gods for favorable winds. He did not deliver an inspiring speech to his nervous sailors. Instead, he sent a secret weapon, a trusted slave and tutor to his own children, a man named Sisinus. Under the cover of darkness, Sisinus slipped away from the Greek fleet in a small boat and rowed directly toward the vast Persian encampment. Sisinus presented himself to the Persian officers as a traitor, a man who had seen the writing on the wall and wished to save his own skin by offering valuable intelligence to the winning side. He was brought before Xerxes himself, the King of Kings, seated on his golden throne with his advisors and generals surrounding him. With a convincing mixture of fear and fawning loyalty, Sisinus delivered a carefully scripted, utterly false piece of intelligence. He told Xerxes that the Greek alliance was crumbling from within. He said the various city-state contingents were on the verge of fighting each other, that the Athenians were preparing to defect, and that the entire Greek fleet was planning to slip away under cover of darkness that very night to scatter to their home ports. The only way to trap them and achieve a decisive, glorious victory, Sisinus whispered, was to send the Persian fleet into the narrow straits of Salamis immediately, before dawn, to block both ends of the channel and catch the Greeks in a state of panicked disarray. It was a brilliant piece of psychological manipulation, a lie tailored perfectly to Xerxes' ego and his deepest desires. The Persian king wanted a quick, crushing victory. He wanted to cement his reputation as an unstoppable conqueror. He also perhaps feared that his massive, unwieldy coalition force might indeed lose momentum if the Greeks escaped. He believed the traitorous slave. That night, the Persian fleet was ordered to sea. Hundreds of ships rowed silently into position, sealing off the escape routes from the straits. The Persian crews, who had been expecting a restful night, were forced to row for hours and then wait at their battle stations, exhausted and tense, as the first gray light of dawn crept over the hills of Attica. When the sun rose, Xerxes had his throne carried to a high promontory overlooking the sea so he could personally witness the annihilation of the Greek fleet. Instead, he watched in growing horror as a fresh, well-rested, and perfectly organized Greek navy emerged from the narrow inlets and slammed into his exhausted, disorganized line. The bronze rams of the Greek triremes punched holes in the sides of the Persian ships. Greek hoplite soldiers, heavily armored spearmen, boarded the entangled enemy vessels and cut down their crews. The narrow waters, which Xerxes had hoped would be a trap for the Greeks, became a slaughterhouse for his own fleet. By the end of the day, the sea was choked with shattered timbers and floating bodies. The Persian navy was broken. Xerxes, fearing that the Greeks would now sail to the Hellespont and destroy the bridge of boats that was his only supply line back to Asia, retreated with the bulk of his army, leaving only a smaller force to be defeated the following year at the Battle of Plataea. Themistocles' ruse, carried out by a single expendable agent, had saved Greece and, by extension, the entire trajectory of Western civilization. The great historian Plutarch, writing centuries later, captured the essence of this type of warfare when he observed, "It is a glorious thing to profit by the folly of one's enemies." But the victory at Salamis was not about folly. It was about the power of a well-placed lie. It was espionage at its most effective, a single whisper in the ear of a king that changed the course of history. The great king's postal service and the art of interception. While the Greeks were perfecting the art of the ruse and the hidden message, the Persians, their great adversaries, were masters of a different aspect of intelligence work, speed and systematic surveillance. The Persian Empire, at its height, stretched from the Indus River in the east to the Danube River and the borders of Egypt in the west. Governing such a vast, diverse, and often rebellious territory required a constant flow of information from the provinces back to the imperial center. To achieve this, the Persians built the Royal Road, an engineering marvel of the ancient world. It was not a single paved highway, but a carefully maintained network of routes and relay stations, complete with fresh horses and couriers stationed at regular intervals, roughly a day's ride apart. The Greek historian Herodotus described the system with awe. Neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor gloom of night stays these courageous couriers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds. This phrase, which would later become the unofficial motto of the United States Postal Service, originally referred to the mounted messengers of the Persian king. A message could travel from the western coast of Anatolia to the capital of Susa, a distance of nearly 1,700 miles, in just 7 to 9 days. A journey that would take a solitary traveler on foot over 3 months was compressed to a little over a week by the relentless efficiency of the relay system. But the Royal Road was not just a tool for governance and administration. It was also a vast, sprawling intelligence-gathering apparatus. The very existence of the road meant that the king's agents, a network of informants known as the king's eyes and the king's ears, could travel anywhere in the empire quickly and with the full authority of the throne behind them. These agents were a blend of official inspectors, traveling judges, and secret police. They would arrive unannounced in a provincial capital, observe the conduct of the local satrap, listen to the whispers of the marketplace, and report everything back directly to Susa. A satrap who was skimming too much tax revenue or quietly building up his own private army would find himself confronted by a royal official who knew more about his activities than seemed possible. The system was designed to create a climate of watchful uncertainty. No one could be sure who among the travelers on the road was a simple merchant and who was an agent of the great king, silently memorizing faces and conversations. This was the world that the Greek city-states, with their fierce independence and constant internal bickering, were up against. They were fighting not just an empire of soldiers, but an empire of information. Caesar's simple shift and the dangers of a public life. As we move from the classical Greek world to the rise of Rome, the tools of espionage become more systematic and in some ways more brutal. The Roman Republic and later the Roman Empire were vast, bureaucratic, and intensely political entities. Holding together a realm that eventually stretched from the rain-swept moors of northern Britain to the burning sands of Arabia required knowing what was happening in every far-flung province, in every restless legionary camp on the frontier, and in every senator's private chambers in the heart of Rome itself. The famed orator, lawyer, and politician Marcus Tullius Cicero, who lived through the final tumultuous decades of the Roman Republic in the 1st century BCE, wrote constantly and fretfully about the state of his private correspondence. His letters to his close friend Atticus are filled with a palpable paranoia about the security of the messengers he employed. In one particularly revealing passage he laments, "I cannot find a faithful message-bearer. How few are they who are able to carry a rather weighty letter without lightening it by reading." Cicero knew, with a certainty born of bitter experience, that his letters were being opened, read, and their contents shared with his political enemies. The informal, personal spy networks of the Greek world had evolved, in Rome, into something closer to a professional, if still largely private, intelligence service. Every wealthy and ambitious senator had his own network of delatores, informers, and professional accusers, who would haunt the forums, the bathhouses, and the dinner parties of the elite, listening for any indiscreet word or hint of a conspiracy. Information was the currency of power in the cutthroat world of Roman politics. It is against this backdrop of constant surveillance and political intrigue that one of the most famous and enduring tools of cryptography was born, the Caesar cipher. The man who gave it his name, Gaius Julius Caesar, was not just a brilliant general and a charismatic populist leader. He was also a man who lived his entire adult life in the glaring spotlight of public attention and the shadow of mortal danger. He needed a way to communicate securely with his generals and political allies in the field, sending orders for troop movements or sensitive political instructions without fear that a captured messenger would reveal his plans to the enemy. His solution was elegant in its simplicity. The Caesar cipher is what modern cryptographers call a substitution cipher. The principle is straightforward. You take the alphabet and you shift it by a fixed number of places. Caesar himself, according to the Roman historian Suetonius, favored a shift of 3. So, using Caesar's method, the letter A would be written as D, B would become E, C would become F. and so on, all the way to the end of the alphabet, where the letters would wrap around. X would become A, Y would become B, and Z would become C. To a Roman soldier or a Gallic tribesman who intercepted the message, it would look like meaningless gibberish, a string of random Latin letters that formed no known words. But to Cicero or one of Caesar's trusted lieutenants, who knew the secret of the three-letter shift, it was a trivial matter to reverse the process and reveal the hidden command: bring the 13th Legion to the banks of the Rubicon. The Caesar cipher is, by modern standards, laughably easy to break. A child with a pencil and paper could crack it in a matter of minutes by simply trying all 25 possible shifts, or by analyzing the frequency of the letters. Noticing, for instance, that in Latin the letter E is by far the most common. But in the context of the 1st century BCE, when literacy itself was far from universal, and the very concept of a systematic cipher was unknown to most people, it was a remarkably effective tool. It was a secret language that could be written down and carried across hostile territory without fear. However, for all his brilliance as a general and his cunning as a codemaker, Caesar's story also serves as an early, brutal, and enduring lesson in the limitations of intelligence. He had an elaborate network of informants and political spies, feeding him details of the conspiracies swirling around him in the Roman Senate. He knew, on some level, that he was a marked man. He had even, according to some accounts, dismissed his personal bodyguard of Spanish swordsmen in the months before his death, perhaps as a gesture of confidence or a miscalculation born of a sense of his own invincibility. Yet, on the Ides of March in 44 BCE, as he entered the Senate chamber for what he thought was a routine meeting, he walked into a conspiracy of over 60 senators who had managed to keep their plot a complete secret. The daggers were hidden beneath their togas. The information was there, somewhere in the whisper network of Rome, but Caesar either did not receive it in time or chose to ignore it. His assassination is the classic tragedy of the spy master who sees everything except the knife that is closest to his heart. The story of Caesar demonstrates a truth that every intelligence agency in the world still grapples with today. Gathering information is only half the battle. The other, often more difficult half, is correctly interpreting it and having the will to act upon it before it is too late. The Chinese master and the 36 stratagems. While the Greeks and Romans were developing their own distinct traditions of espionage and deception in the Mediterranean world, a parallel and arguably far more sophisticated and systematic tradition was evolving thousands of miles to the east in ancient China. The Chinese approach to statecraft and warfare was, from a very early period, deeply infused with a philosophy that prized cunning, deception, and the manipulation of information above brute force. The ideal general, in the Chinese tradition, was not the one who won 100 bloody battles, but the one who could subdue the enemy without ever having to fight at all. This philosophy finds its most distilled and enduring expression in a remarkable book known as The Art of War, traditionally attributed to the military strategist Sun Tzu, who lived in the late spring and autumn period of Chinese history, around the 5th century BCE, roughly contemporaneous with Herodotus and the Greek-Persian Wars. The Art of War is a slim volume composed of a series of concise, almost poetic aphorisms, but its influence on military and strategic thinking across East Asia, and eventually the entire world, has been immense. And at the very heart of Sun Tzu's philosophy lies the supreme importance of intelligence and deception. Sun Tzu devotes an entire chapter, the 13th and final one, to the subject of spies. He outlines a remarkably detailed and sophisticated typology of agents, a framework that remains surprisingly relevant even today. He describes 5 distinct categories of spies. First, there are local spies, who are simply the ordinary inhabitants of a region who can be recruited or bribed to provide information about the terrain, the local economy, and the movements of enemy forces. Second, there are inward spies, which we would today call moles, enemy officials, disgruntled bureaucrats, or ambitious courtiers, who can be turned and made to work for your side from within the enemy's own power structure. Third, there are converted spies, which we call double agents, enemy spies who have been captured, but instead of being executed, are turned and sent back to their masters with carefully crafted false information. Fourth, there are doomed spies, agents who are knowingly sent on a mission with false information, intended to be captured and to feed the enemy a deliberate lie, often at the cost of their own lives. And finally, there are surviving spies, the elite agents who are sent deep into enemy territory and are expected to return with valuable, actionable intelligence. Sun Tzu's assessment of the value of such an intelligence apparatus is stark and uncompromising. He writes, "Knowledge of the enemy's dispositions can only be obtained from other men." He argues that the wise general who invests heavily in a network of spies will be forewarned and therefore forearmed. He calls espionage the most important element in war and insists that no expense should be spared in cultivating and rewarding spies, for the cost of a spy network is trivial compared to the cost of a prolonged, bloody campaign fought in ignorance. He concludes with a chilling and timeless piece of advice: be subtle, and use your spies for every kind of business. Alongside the art of war, Chinese strategic culture produced another classic text that is essentially a handbook of deception, the 36 Stratagems. This collection of proverbs and historical anecdotes, compiled over centuries, provides a catalog of tricks, ruses, and psychological manipulations that can be used to gain an advantage over an opponent. Many of these stratagems are pure espionage in narrative form. Deceive the heavens to cross the ocean is the first stratagem, and it describes the act of disguising one's true intentions by doing something so obvious and routine that the enemy's vigilance is dulled. Create something from nothing is the art of the bluff, convincing an enemy you have a strength or a secret weapon that does not, in fact, exist. Replace the beams with rotten timbers describes the long-term, patient work of subversion, weakening an enemy's state from within by corrupting its officials and sowing discord among its people. Perhaps the most famous of all is the beauty trap, using seduction, romance, or sexual allure to gain access to an enemy's secrets or to cloud his judgment. The sheer breadth and psychological depth of these stratagems demonstrate that the Chinese tradition viewed the contest of intelligence and deception not as a minor adjunct to warfare, but as the very essence of strategic competition. Part 2. The Medieval World: Faith, Fire, and Forgery. The Spy Who Would Be Bishop and the Lost Sons of a King. As the classical world of Greece and Rome crumbled and Europe entered the long centuries of the Middle Ages, the nature of espionage shifted. The grand, centralized bureaucracies of the Roman Empire were gone, replaced by a fractured landscape of quarreling feudal kingdoms, powerful and independent-minded dukes and counts, and the overarching universal authority of the Roman Catholic Church. In this world, spying became more personal, more intimate, and often more brutal. It was the tool of a monarch trying to keep an eye on his own rebellious nobles, of a bishop trying to root out heresy in his diocese, or of a pope trying to navigate the treacherous currents of European dynastic politics. One of the most remarkable and detailed spy stories from the early medieval period comes from the court of the Frankish king Clovis I, who ruled from 481 to 511 CE, and is credited with uniting the various Frankish tribes into the first powerful Christian kingdom in what would become France. Our source for this story is Gregory of Tours, a bishop and historian of the 6th century, whose history of the Franks is a vivid, often gruesome, and endlessly fascinating window into the Merovingian world. Gregory tells a story of how Clovis, who was constantly scheming to expand his territory at the expense of his neighbors, used a spy to lay the groundwork for a war of conquest against a rival kingdom. The target was the kingdom of the Ripuarian Franks, a related but independent group of Franks who lived along the Rhine River. Clovis wanted to weaken them from within before he launched his military campaign. To do this, he sent an agent, a man disguised as a simple beggar, into the territory of the Ripuarian Franks with a very specific mission. the agent was carrying a gift, a collection of beautifully crafted but deliberately cheap and gilded trinkets, bracelets and sword belts made of bronze but coated with a thin wash of gold to make them appear precious. The agent's instructions were to present these gifts to the Ripuarian warriors, and while doing so, to spread a specific and seditious rumor. The rumor was that Clovis, the powerful king to the west, was a generous lord who rewarded his followers with real gold and silver, and that the sons of the Ripuarian king were being denied their rightful inheritance and treated poorly by their father. The agent was to find the king's own sons and whisper to them that if they rose up against their father, Clovis would support them and reward them handsomely. The ruse worked. The seeds of distrust and greed were planted. The Ripuarian king's own sons, tempted by the false gold and the promise of real power, turned against their father. When Clovis finally marched his army into their territory, he found a kingdom already torn apart by internal strife and betrayal. The conquest was swift and relatively bloodless, a victory prepared not on the battlefield, but in the whispering shadows of a rival court. It was a classic application of what Sun Tzu would have called inward spies, and what modern intelligence agencies call covert action, using espionage to shape the political landscape to your advantage before the first soldier even crosses the border. The Knights Who Spied, the Crusader States, and the Art of Survival. A few centuries later, the Crusades, that series of bloody religious wars fought between Christian Europe and the Islamic powers of the Middle East for control of the Holy Land, created a unique and intense pressure cooker environment for espionage. The Crusaders established 4 major political territories in the Levant: Jerusalem, Antioch, Edessa, and Tripoli, each functioning as a separate Latin Christian state. They were islands of Western European feudal society, planted in a vast and hostile sea of Muslim populations. Their survival, for nearly 200 years, depended not just on the strength of their castle walls and the valor of their armored knights, but on their ability to understand and anticipate the movements and intentions of their far more numerous Muslim neighbors. The military orders of the Crusades, particularly the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller, were far more than the simple warrior monks of popular legend. They were, in effect, the first multinational intelligence agencies of the Western world. The Templars, with their headquarters on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem and their network of commanderies and estates stretching across every kingdom in Europe, were uniquely positioned to gather and transmit information. A Templar knight traveling from Paris to Jerusalem on official business of the order was also a living, breathing conduit of intelligence. He would carry letters, but he would also carry in his head a wealth of information about political conditions, military readiness, and local rumors from every region he passed through. The order's internal communications network, protected by the religious and military discipline of its members, was one of the most secure and reliable in the medieval world. The Crusaders also learned by bitter necessity the value of what we would today call human intelligence, information gathered from local sources. They employed native Christians from the various Eastern churches, Armenians, Syriacs, Maronites, as scouts, interpreters, and spies. These individuals could blend into the local population, speak the languages, and report back on the movements of Muslim armies or the political intrigues of the surrounding emirates. The survival of the Crusader states, surrounded as they were by the powerful empires of the Seljuk Turks and later the Ayyubids under Saladin, is a testament to the effectiveness of this intelligence apparatus. Saladin, the great Kurdish sultan who would eventually reconquer Jerusalem in 1187, was himself a master of espionage and deception. Before his final campaign, his agents had thoroughly penetrated the fractious Crusader leadership, exploiting the bitter rivalries between different factions and different military orders. He knew exactly when and where to strike. His victory at the Battle of Hattin, which doomed the Kingdom of Jerusalem, was as much a triumph of intelligence as it was of arms. The Cipher of the Doge and the Rise of Venice. While the Crusaders were learning the hard lessons of espionage in the burning deserts of the Holy Land, a different kind of intelligence power was rising from the lagoons of the Adriatic Sea. The most serene Republic of Venice was not a land empire but a maritime trading state, a city built on wooden piles driven into the mud, whose wealth and power depended entirely on its ability to control the sea lanes and the flow of goods between east and west. For Venice, information was not just a tool of war, it was the very lifeblood of commerce. Knowing the price of pepper in Alexandria before your competitors did, knowing which monsoon winds were about to shift in the Indian Ocean, knowing whether the Byzantine emperor in Constantinople was planning to raise tariffs on Venetian merchants, this was the difference between a fortune made and a fleet lost at sea. To protect its commercial and diplomatic secrets, the Venetian state developed one of the most sophisticated and secretive intelligence bureaucracies in pre-modern history. At the heart of this system was the Council of Ten, a small, rotating committee of powerful nobles who were responsible for the security of the state. The Ten operated in total secrecy, their deliberations hidden from even the broader Venetian Senate. They controlled a vast network of informants, both within Venice and in every major port and court in the Mediterranean. Venetian ambassadors, who were among the most skilled diplomats in Europe, were required to submit detailed reports, known as relazioni, upon their return from a foreign posting. These reports were not just polite summaries of court gossip. They were exhaustive analyses of the foreign state's military strength, its economic resources, its political factions, and the personal weaknesses and ambitions of its ruling figures. These relazioni were treated as state secrets of the highest order and were stored in the secret archives of the Doge's palace. To protect the sensitive information flowing back to the lagoon, the Venetian chancery also developed its own sophisticated systems of codes and ciphers. The earliest Venetian ciphers were simple substitution systems, similar to the Caesar cipher but with additional twists. They employed nomenclators, which were essentially code books that combined a cipher alphabet for individual letters with a list of special symbols or code words for frequently used names, titles, and phrases. For example, the cipher might use a simple symbol for the Pope, a different symbol for the King of France, and yet another for the Ottoman Sultan. A Venetian dispatch, even if it were intercepted by a rival power like Genoa or by agents of the Papal States, would appear as a baffling mixture of random letters and strange, meaningless symbols. The existence of the nomenclator, known only to the sender and the intended recipient in Venice, was the key that unlocked the message. Venice's mastery of information management, diplomacy, and secret communications allowed a small city-state with a relatively small population and no natural resources to project power across the Mediterranean for over 1,000 years. It was a triumph of brain over brawn, of the cipher over the canon. The Vatican's Black Chamber and the limits of secrecy. The papacy, the central governing institution of the Roman Catholic Church, was also a major power in the world of medieval and Renaissance espionage. The Pope was not just a spiritual leader. He was the ruler of the Papal States, a significant territory in central Italy, and a major diplomatic player in the endlessly shifting alliances of European politics. The Vatican needed to know what the kings of France, Spain, and England were planning. It needed to monitor the activities of the rival Italian city-states, and it needed, above all, to maintain the doctrinal purity and political unity of the Church in the face of dissenting voices and emerging heresies. To meet these needs, the Vatican maintained its own extensive intelligence apparatus, which included a sophisticated code-breaking office, a veritable black chamber, long before the term was coined. The Vatican's cryptanalysts, often brilliant linguists and mathematicians drawn from the ranks of the clergy, were among the best in Europe. They were tasked with reading the encrypted diplomatic correspondence of foreign powers. A significant portion of the Vatican's secret archives, a vast collection of documents accumulated over centuries, consists of intercepted and decrypted letters from ambassadors and monarchs. The popes of the Renaissance, men like Alexander VI of the Borgia family and Julius II, the warrior pope, were as steeped in the arts of political intrigue and information warfare as any secular prince. Yet the Vatican's own security was not always impregnable. One of the most delicious and enduring stories of Renaissance espionage involves the capture of a Vatican cipher by the Republic of Venice. According to the tale, which may be more legend than fact but is nonetheless instructive, the Venetian ambassador to the Holy See managed to obtain a copy of the Vatican's most secret nomenclator. The method of acquisition was classic espionage, the seduction of a high-ranking papal secretary by a beautiful Venetian courtesan who was secretly in the employ of the Council of Ten. With access to the secretary's private chambers, the courtesan was able to make a copy of the codebook, which was then smuggled back to Venice. For a period of time, the Venetians were able to read the Pope's most private and sensitive communications to his ambassadors across Europe, giving them an incalculable advantage in the diplomatic chess game of the Italian wars. The story, whether true or a cautionary tale, perfectly illustrates the eternal vulnerability of even the most secure systems, the human factor. A code, no matter how complex, is only as secure as the people who have access to it. A disloyal secretary or a susceptible heart can undo the work of the finest cryptographers. Part 3. The Renaissance and Reformation, the Age of the Spy Master. Sir Francis Walsingham, The Eyes of the Virgin Queen. If the medieval world saw the rise of state-sponsored intelligence in a fitful and personal way, the Tudor period in England, and specifically the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, witnessed the emergence of the first truly modern, professional, and ruthlessly effective spy master in Western history. His name was Sir Francis Walsingham, and he served as Elizabeth's principal secretary from 1573 until his death in 1590. Walsingham was a man of somber dress, intense Protestant conviction, and a work ethic that bordered on the fanatical. He was, in the words of one historian, a man of marvelous diligence and great intelligence. He was also, without question, the most feared and effective intelligence chief of his age. Walsingham operated in a world of constant existential threat. Elizabeth I, a Protestant queen, was the target of endless conspiracies hatched by Catholic powers in Europe, particularly Spain under King Philip II and France under the influence of the powerful Guise family. The ultimate goal of these conspiracies was to assassinate Elizabeth and replace her on the English throne with her Catholic cousin, Mary Stuart, the Queen of Scots, who was being held under house arrest in England. Walsingham understood that in this kind of secret war, knowledge was not just power, it was survival. His personal motto, which he had inscribed on his official seal, was, "Knowledge is never too dear." He meant it literally. He spent vast sums of his own money, in addition to the limited funds provided by the parsimonious queen, to build and maintain his intelligence network. He died deeply in debt, having impoverished himself in the service of the English state. Walsingham's network of intelligencers was a sprawling, eclectic, and remarkably effective web that stretched across the courts and ports of Europe. His agents included not just professional spies, but a motley crew of merchants, travelers, exiled English Catholics who had been turned impoverished scholars, and even, on occasion, poets and playwrights. The famous dramatist Christopher Marlowe, author of Dr. Faustus, is believed by many scholars to have been one of Walsingham's operatives, using his travels and his connections in the literary world as cover for intelligence gathering. Walsingham also ran agents inside the French embassy in London and maintained a close watch on the comings and goings of anyone connected to Mary, Queen of Scots. Walsingham had a particular and personal obsession with the arts of secret writing. He employed a brilliant cryptographer and forger named Thomas Philippes, a man of unassuming appearance but prodigious talent. Philippes was a master of both creating secure ciphers for Walsingham's own communications and, more importantly, breaking the ciphers used by England's enemies. He was also a skilled forger who could flawlessly imitate handwriting and replicate the intricate wax seals used to authenticate diplomatic letters. It was the combination of Walsingham's ruthless operational skill and Philippes's technical genius that would spring the most famous trap in the history of Elizabethan espionage, the entrapment and execution of Mary, Queen of Scots. The Babington Plot and the Beer Barrel Letters. By 1586, Mary, Queen of Scots, had been a prisoner in England for nearly 19 years. She was the focal point of every Catholic plot against Elizabeth. Walsingham knew that as long as Mary lived, Elizabeth's life would be in constant danger. But Elizabeth was deeply reluctant to sign the death warrant of an anointed queen, even a rival one. Walsingham needed undeniable proof that Mary was actively complicit in a plot to assassinate Elizabeth. He needed a confession in writing. The opportunity came in the form of a young, idealistic, and reckless English Catholic gentleman named Anthony Babington. Babington and a small group of fellow conspirators hatched a plot to assassinate Elizabeth and simultaneously free Mary from her captivity. They communicated with Mary through letters smuggled into her heavily guarded residence at Chartley Hall. The method of smuggling was ingenious. The letters were hidden inside the bungs of barrels of beer that were regularly delivered to the house. What Babington and Mary did not know was that every single one of those barrels was being intercepted by Walsingham's men before it reached Mary. The letters were carefully extracted, copied by Thomas Philippes, and then replaced in the barrels as if nothing had happened. The beer continued its journey, and Mary continued to believe she had a secure, secret channel of communication with her supporters in the outside world. In reality, she was writing letters directly into the hands of the man who intended to destroy her. Philippes did more than just read the letters. He decoded Mary's cipher, a relatively complex nomenclator system. He then waited for the crucial piece of evidence. Finally, in a letter to Babington dated July 17, 1586, Mary explicitly endorsed the plot to assassinate Elizabeth. She wrote, "Then shall it be time to set the 6 gentlemen to work." The 6 gentlemen were Babington's designated assassins. Walsingham now had his proof, but Philippes added a final, devilish touch. On the blank lower portion of Mary's deciphered letter, he drew a tiny, almost invisible gallows, a symbol of the fate that now awaited her. Armed with the evidence of Mary's treason, Walsingham presented the case to Elizabeth. The Queen, after much anguish and hesitation, finally signed the death warrant. Mary, Queen of Scots, was executed at Fotheringhay Castle in February 1587, after being implicated in plots against Queen Elizabeth I. The execution sent shockwaves across Europe. King Philip II of Spain, who had been contemplating an invasion of England, now had his final justification. He ordered the assembly of the Great Spanish Armada. A year later, in 1588, that armada sailed up the English Channel, only to be scattered and destroyed by a combination of English seamanship and devastating storms. Walsingham's intelligence network, however, had not been idle. His agents in Spain had been providing detailed reports on the size, composition, and readiness of the armada for months, allowing England to prepare its defenses. The victory over the armada cemented England's status as a major naval power and secured the Protestant Reformation on the island. And it all began with a letter hidden in a beer barrel and read by a man who understood that knowledge truly is never too dear. The King's Cipher, Louis XIV and the Great Cipher of Rossignol. Across the English Channel, in the glittering court of the Sun King, Louis XIV of France, a different kind of cryptographic drama was unfolding. Louis XIV was the most powerful absolute monarch in Europe, and his reign was the apogee of French power and cultural influence. He was also deeply concerned with the security of his own diplomatic and military correspondence. His solution was to commission the creation of what became known as the Great Cipher, one of the most famous and for a very long time unbreakable ciphers in history. The architects of the Great Cipher were a father and son team, Antoine and Bonaventure Rossignol. Antoine Rossignol first came to the attention of the French court during the siege of the Huguenot stronghold of Réalmont in 1626. The royal army had intercepted a coded letter from the besieged city, and Rossignol, then a young mathematician, was able to break the cipher. The decrypted letter revealed that the city was running out of food and ammunition and was on the verge of surrender. Armed with this knowledge, the French commander was able to negotiate a swift capitulation. Cardinal Richelieu, the king's powerful chief minister, immediately recognized Rossignol's genius and brought him into the service of the state. Antoine Rossignol and later his son Bonaventure devoted their careers to the cryptographic service of the French crown. They developed the Great Cipher specifically for the most sensitive communications of Louis XIV. This was no simple substitution cipher or even a basic nomenclator. The Great Cipher used a vast array of symbols, over 500 distinct characters, to represent not just letters, but entire syllables, common words, and even the names of important individuals and places. Some symbols were nulls that meant nothing at all and were inserted simply to confuse anyone trying to break the code. The complexity was staggering. Even more ingeniously, the Rossignols incorporated a trap for unwary code breakers. Certain symbols, if deciphered in the obvious way, would yield a perfectly coherent but completely false message, leading the enemy analyst down a blind alley. For over a century, the Great Cipher was considered invincible. After the deaths of the Rossignols, the secret of its construction was lost. The encrypted letters in the French archives, filled with their mysterious and elegant symbols, sat unread for generation after generation. They were, for all practical purposes, dead documents. It was not until the late 19th century, nearly 200 years later, that a French military cryptanalyst named Étienne Bazeres took up the challenge. Bazeres, a brilliant and eccentric figure, spent 3 years of obsessive, painstaking labor trying to unlock the secret of the Great Cipher. He noticed patterns, counted frequencies, and made educated guesses. Finally, in 1893, he achieved a breakthrough. He realized that many of the symbols represented syllables rather than single letters, and he painstakingly reconstructed the codebook. When Bazeres finally read the long silent letters of Louis XIV, he uncovered a treasure trove of historical secrets. One of the most dramatic revelations was the true identity of the man in the iron mask, a mysterious prisoner held for decades in French prisons under conditions of extreme secrecy. The decrypted letters confirmed that the prisoner was, in fact, a disgraced French general named Vivien de Boulande, who had been imprisoned for his cowardice and incompetence during a military campaign in the Alps. The legend of the man in the iron mask, which had inspired countless romantic novels and speculative theories, including the idea that he was the king's secret twin brother, was finally laid to rest by the patient work of a code breaker. The story of the Great Cipher is a powerful reminder that a secret, once lost, can remain hidden for centuries, and that the work of the cryptanalyst is often a form of archaeology, digging through the layers of time to recover the lost voices of history. Gentlemen reading mail, the rise of the Black Chambers. As the 17th century gave way to the 18th, the age of enlightenment, espionage, and code-breaking began a slow but inexorable transformation from the personal obsession of powerful monarchs and their brilliant servants into a routine, institutional function of the modern state. Governments across Europe, realizing that the letters flowing through their ever-expanding postal systems contained an absolute treasure trove of diplomatic, military, and commercial secrets, created permanent, secret institutions dedicated to the systematic violation of privacy. These institutions were known as Black Chambers, from the French term cabinet noir. A black chamber was, in essence, a secret room or suite of rooms located inside a major central post office. Here, a small team of skilled and trusted workers, cryptographers, translators, and expert seal forgers would carry out their daily, clandestine work. Every night, diplomatic mail pouches bound for foreign embassies or passing through the country in transit would be quietly diverted to the Black Chamber. The letters would be carefully opened, usually by gently heating the wax seal so it could be lifted away intact. The contents would be copied, often by multiple scribes working simultaneously. If the letter was in cipher, it would be passed to the cryptanalysts for decoding. Then, with equal care, the letter would be resealed, using a forged replica of the original seal, and returned to the mail pouch before the morning delivery. The unsuspecting ambassador would receive his letter, the wax seal apparently pristine and unbroken, and never suspect that the host government now knew every secret it contained. The most famous and efficient of these black chambers was the Geheime Kabinettskanzlei in Vienna, which served the Habsburg rulers of the Austrian Empire. This office operated with a kind of industrial efficiency. Mail pouches would arrive at the Vienna post office in the early evening. They would be rushed to the Black Chamber, where a team of specialists would work through the night. The mail would be opened, read, translated, deciphered if necessary, copied, resealed, and returned to the mail coach before the 6 a.m. departure. Ambassadors in Vienna constantly complained that their dispatches seemed to arrive late or showed signs of tampering, but the Viennese Black Chamber was so skilled that proof was nearly impossible to come by. The information gleaned from this operation gave the Austrian Empire a significant advantage in the complex diplomatic dance of 18th century Europe. This practice was considered by the governments that engaged in it to be a perfectly normal, if somewhat ungentlemanly, tool of statecraft. Every major power had a black chamber of some sort. It was an open secret among the diplomatic corps, a fact of life that was grudgingly accepted. That broad, cynical acceptance, however, would eventually run headlong into a newer, more fastidious, and distinctly American sensibility about the limits of state power and the privacy of correspondence. The American Black Chamber and a secretary's famous folly. In the years immediately following the First World War, the United States government, which had traditionally been somewhat naive and amateurish in the realm of international espionage and cryptanalysis, found itself in possession of a remarkably effective secret weapon. It was a small, unofficial code-breaking office operating out of a nondescript brownstone townhouse in New York City. This office, funded jointly by the State Department and the War Department, was called the Cipher Bureau, but it would become known to history as the American Black Chamber. Its director was a brilliant, irascible, and colorful Hoosier named Herbert O. Yardley. Yardley had discovered his talent for codes almost by accident. During the First World War, he was working as a telegrapher for the State Department when he became intrigued by the coded messages that crossed his desk. With no formal training, he began to teach himself the art of cryptanalysis. He discovered he had a natural, almost intuitive gift for seeing the patterns hidden within the chaos of numbers and letters. By the end of the war, he was the head of the U.S. Army's cryptographic section. When the war ended, Yardley, along with a small group of colleagues, convinced the government to let them continue their work in secret, focusing on the diplomatic traffic of foreign nations. The American Black Chamber's greatest triumph came in 1921 and 1922 during the Washington Naval Conference. This was a major international gathering called by the United States to limit the naval arms race that had been spiraling out of control among the world's great powers. The United States, Great Britain, Japan, France, and Italy were all at the negotiating table, each jockeying for advantage. The key issue was the ratio of capital ships, battleships, and battle cruisers that each nation would be allowed to maintain. The American negotiating position was that the United States and Great Britain should have parity, with Japan allowed a slightly smaller fleet. The Japanese, however, insisted on a ratio of 10-7, which would give them a much stronger position in the Pacific. Yardley and his team were tasked with reading the Japanese diplomatic traffic. They succeeded. They cracked the Japanese diplomatic codes, and Yardley was able to provide the American negotiators with the verbatim text of the instructions being sent from the Japanese Foreign Ministry in Tokyo to the Japanese delegation in Washington. The intercepts revealed that the Japanese insistence on the 10-7 ratio was not a hard, non-negotiable demand. It was a bargaining position. The Japanese government had secretly instructed its delegation that, if pushed, they could accept the lower American proposal. Armed with this inside knowledge, the American Secretary of State, Charles Evans Hughes, was able to hold firm at the negotiating table. He knew the Japanese would eventually fold. They did. The resulting five-power naval treaty was a significant diplomatic victory for the United States, and it was won almost entirely because of the secret work of Herbert Yardley and his small team of code breakers. The story should have ended there, with Yardley hailed as a quiet national hero. Instead, it took a turn toward the absurd. In 1929, a new administration took office in Washington. The new Secretary of State was Henry L. Stimson, a distinguished lawyer, a patrician figure of the old school, and a man of deep personal integrity. When Stimson was briefed on the existence and activities of the American Black Chamber, he was, by his own account, appalled. He viewed the systematic reading of other nations' diplomatic mail as a dishonorable and unethical practice, something beneath the dignity of the United States. He immediately ordered the funding for the Black Chamber to be cut off, effectively shutting down America's primary peacetime code-breaking capability on the eve of a period of rising global tension and militarism. The explanation Stimson gave for his decision has become one of the most famous and, in retrospect, ironic quotes in the entire history of intelligence. "Gentlemen," he said, "do not read each other's mail." It was a noble sentiment, an expression of a bygone code of honor in international relations, but it was also stunningly naive. The other gentlemen in Tokyo, Berlin, and Moscow were certainly reading America's mail, or they were trying to, with increasing success. Stimson's decision left the United States blind to Japanese diplomatic intentions during the crucial years leading up to the attack on Pearl Harbor. A decade later, as Stimson himself served as Secretary of War during the Second World War and oversaw the vast, secret effort to build the atomic bomb, he had ample opportunity to reflect on the wisdom of his earlier idealism. The world had changed, and the quaint notion that gentlemen did not read each other's mail had been buried in the rubble of global war. Part 4. The Great War of the Mind. Room 40 and the Telegram that Changed the World. The First World War, which erupted in the summer of 1914, was a conflict of unprecedented scale and industrial horror. Millions of men were fed into the grinding machinery of trench warfare on the Western Front. But alongside the visible war of artillery barrages and poison gas, a parallel, invisible war of the mind was being fought with equal intensity. In the years leading up to the war, the British Admiralty had quietly established a top-secret code-breaking unit in a nondescript suite of offices in the old Admiralty building in London. It was designated simply as Room 40, a name derived from its location and designed to be utterly forgettable. The men and women of Room 40, and they included not just naval officers but university professors, linguists, and eccentric puzzle solvers, achieved an intelligence coup of staggering importance in the very first months of the war. Through a combination of luck, daring, and sheer brilliance, they managed to obtain copies of the three main codebooks used by the Imperial German Navy: the Signalbuch der Kaiserlichen Marine, the Verkehrsbuch, and the Handelsschiffsverkehrsbuch. These were not simple substitution ciphers. They were complex systems that combined code words for ships and places with super-encipherment tables that changed frequently. But with the physical books in their possession, the cryptanalysts of Room 40 held the master key. They could, with varying degrees of difficulty and delay, read nearly every encrypted wireless message the German fleet sent. For most of the war, this incredible advantage was used with caution. The Admiralty was terrified that if they acted on every piece of intercepted intelligence, the Germans would realize their codes had been compromised and would change the entire system. The intelligence from Room 40, codenamed Ultra in the Second World War, but simply the Secret in the First, was a sword that had to be wielded sparingly. There were moments of intense frustration, such as the Battle of Jutland in 1916, when failures in communication and interpretation of the Room 40 intercepts prevented the British Grand Fleet from achieving the decisive, Trafalgar-like victory over the German high seas fleet that had seemed within reach. But the single most consequential act of the Room 40 codebreakers came not at sea, but in the realm of global diplomacy. The breakthrough came in January 1917, when the cryptanalysts intercepted a lengthy coded transmission originating from German Foreign Minister Arthur Zimmermann, addressed to his country's diplomatic representative in Mexico City, Heinrich von Eckart. As the message slowly emerged from the cipher, its contents sent a shockwave through the British government. The telegram proposed a secret, offensive alliance between Germany and Mexico. The terms were explosive. If the United States entered the war on the side of the Allies, Germany would support Mexico in a war of reconquest against its northern neighbor. Mexico would be helped to recover the lost territory of Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona, lands the United States had annexed in the Mexican-American War of the 1840s. The telegram also suggested that Mexico should act as a mediator to persuade Japan, a German ally in the war, to switch sides and attack the United States in the Pacific. The British now possessed a diplomatic bomb of immense power. They knew that if they could present this decrypted message to the American government, it would almost certainly tip the United States, which had been staunchly neutral, into the war on the Allied side. But there was a delicate problem. How could the British reveal the contents of the telegram without admitting to the Americans that they were systematically reading German diplomatic traffic, and by implication, probably reading American diplomatic traffic as well? The solution was a masterpiece of intelligence tradecraft. The British had an agent in Mexico who was able to obtain a copy of the telegram as it had been received in the German embassy there, a version that had been re-enciphered in a slightly different older code. The British then presented the decoded text to the American ambassador in London with a cover story that they had obtained it through espionage in Mexico, not through code breaking in London. The American government was initially skeptical. Some suspected it was a crude British forgery designed to drag the United States into the war. But Zimmermann himself, in a staggering act of diplomatic incompetence, confirmed the telegram's authenticity at a press conference in Berlin. The American public was outraged. The idea of a foreign power conspiring to redraw America's southern border was an intolerable insult and a direct threat to national security. President Woodrow Wilson, who had campaigned for re-election on the slogan, "He kept us out of war," asked Congress for a declaration of war against Germany. The United States officially joined World War I in April 1917 following escalating tensions with Germany. The fresh infusion of American manpower and industrial resources would prove decisive in breaking the stalemate on the Western Front and forcing Germany's surrender in November 1918. The Zimmermann telegram stands as one of the clearest and most dramatic examples in all of history of a single piece of code-breaking intelligence altering the entire course of world events. The Enigma of Bletchley Park, saving the world in secret. A generation later, the world was once again engulfed in war, and the quiet heroes of the code-breaking war would once again emerge from the unlikeliest of places, this time from a sprawling, ugly Victorian estate called Bletchley Park, located 50 miles northwest of London. In the early months of the Second World War, the British government assembled a team of the most brilliant and unconventional minds they could find and sequestered them at Bletchley. The group included mathematicians from Cambridge and Oxford, chess champions, linguists who could master a new language in a matter of weeks, crossword puzzle experts recruited from the pages of the Daily Telegraph, and a smattering of eccentric geniuses who defied all easy categorization. Their mission was to do what the German High Command believed was impossible, to break the Enigma code. The Enigma machine was a portable electromechanical cipher device that looked something like a complicated typewriter in a wooden box. It used a system of rotating rotors and a plug board to scramble the letters of the alphabet. When an operator pressed a key, an electrical current would flow through the maze of rotors and wires, and a different letter would light up on the lamp board. The number of possible settings for the rotors and the plug board was astronomical, trillions upon trillions of combinations. The Germans were so confident in the security of Enigma that they used it for nearly all of their military and intelligence communications, from the movement of individual U-boats in the Atlantic to the strategic orders of the High Command in Berlin. Breaking Enigma, they believed, was a mathematical impossibility. They were wrong. The story of the breaking of Enigma is a complex one, and it does not begin at Bletchley Park. It begins in Poland. In the years leading up to the war, a brilliant team of Polish mathematicians, Marian Rejewski, Jerzy Różycki, and Henryk Zygalski, had been working on the Enigma problem with extraordinary dedication and insight. Using advanced mathematical techniques and a deep understanding of the machine's design, they had managed to reverse engineer the internal wiring of the Enigma's rotors and had even built a device which they called a bomba, the Polish word for bomb, so named because of its ticking sound, to help test possible settings. In the summer of 1939, just weeks before the German invasion of Poland, the Polish intelligence service shared all of their hard-won knowledge, including their replica Enigma machines and their bomba designs, with British and French intelligence. It was an act of extraordinary generosity and strategic foresight that would save countless Allied lives. Armed with the Polish Foundation, the team at Bletchley Park, under the intellectual leadership of the brilliant and tragically troubled mathematician Alan Turing, set about industrializing the process of breaking Enigma on a massive scale. Turing and his colleague Gordon Welchman designed an improved, much faster, and more sophisticated version of the Polish bomba, which they called the bomb. These machines, which were built in large numbers by the British Tabulating Machine Company, were not computers in the modern sense. They were highly specialized electromechanical search engines. They could be configured to test thousands of possible Enigma rotor settings per second, looking for the one setting that would transform the intercepted gibberish of a German message into recognizable German text. The work at Bletchley Park was grueling, repetitive, and conducted under immense pressure. The codebreakers worked around the clock in cramped, poorly heated wooden huts. They were a motley, eccentric, and often socially awkward group, but they were bound together by a fierce sense of purpose and a profound understanding of the stakes. The intelligence they produced, which was given the code name Ultra, was a secret weapon of unparalleled power. It allowed the Allies to read the operational orders of the German U-boat fleet in the Atlantic, enabling them to reroute vital convoys of food and war material away from the waiting wolf packs. It allowed General Bernard Montgomery to read the battle plans of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel in North Africa, enabling him to defeat the Desert Fox at the crucial Battle of El Alamein. And, perhaps most importantly, it allowed the Allies to confirm that their elaborate deception plan for D-Day, Operation Fortitude, which convinced the Germans that the invasion would come at Calais rather than Normandy, was working. Hitler kept his best armored divisions waiting uselessly at Calais for an invasion that never came, while the real invasion stormed ashore in Normandy. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, would later state that Ultra was decisive to the Allied victory. Some historians have estimated that the work of Bletchley Park shortened the war in Europe by at least 2 years and saved perhaps as many as 14 million lives. And for 3 decades after the war ended, none of them could speak a word of it. The secret of Bletchley Park remained one of the most closely guarded secrets of the 20th century. The unsung heroes, the code talkers of the Pacific. While the brilliant mathematicians of Bletchley Park were breaking the mechanical codes of the Germans in Europe, the United States Marine Corps was employing a completely different and equally ingenious method of secure communication in the vast, island-dotted theater of the Pacific War against Japan. The Japanese military had proven to be exceptionally skilled at intercepting American radio communications and at breaking standard American codes. The Marines needed a code that could not be broken by any amount of mathematical analysis or linguistic study. The military ultimately relied on indigenous languages, many of which were unfamiliar outside their communities, to create highly secure battlefield communications. The idea of using Native American languages for military communication had been explored on a limited scale during the First World War, but it was in the Second World War that the concept was developed into a formal, highly effective system. The most famous and widely used of these systems was the Navajo Code Talker program. The Marine Corps recruited young Navajo men from the vast reservation lands of the American Southwest. These were men who had grown up speaking both English and the intricate tonal language of the Diné, the Navajo people. The Navajo language is extraordinarily complex, with a syntax and a system of verb conjugations that are utterly alien to any European or Asian language. It has no written alphabet and was, at the time, spoken by only a tiny fraction of people outside the Navajo Nation. To a Japanese cryptanalyst intercepting the radio transmissions, the stream of sounds would be completely incomprehensible, a fluid, melodic, but utterly meaningless torrent of noise. But the Navajo code talkers did more than just speak Navajo over the radio. The Marines, in consultation with the first group of code talker recruits, developed a formal two-layer code. First, they created a vocabulary of Navajo code words for common military terms that did not exist in the traditional Navajo language. For example, a submarine became beshlo, which means iron fish. A bomber became jaysho, meaning buzzard. A grenade became nimasi, meaning potato. America became nehema, meaning our mother. Even more ingeniously, they developed a system for spelling out proper names or unusual words using Navajo words that corresponded to the first letter of the English alphabet. So, the letter A might be represented by Wolachi, ant, Belasana, apple, or Tisi-nil, axe. A message could alternate between using these code words for letters and using the specific military vocabulary. The Navajo code talkers served with immense distinction in every major marine amphibious assault in the Pacific, from Guadalcanal to Iwo Jima to Okinawa. They operated under fire, hauling their heavy radio equipment through jungle and across volcanic sand, transmitting vital tactical information, calling in artillery strikes, reporting enemy positions, coordinating troop movements, in a code that the Japanese never came close to breaking. A Japanese general later admitted that while they had been able to break American Air Force codes, they had been completely baffled by the code used by the Marines. The speed and accuracy of the code talkers were also legendary. A message that might take 30 minutes to encrypt and decrypt using a conventional cipher machine could be transmitted, understood, and acted upon by a code talker in a matter of seconds. They were human cipher machines of extraordinary efficiency. For decades after the war, the role of the Navajo code talkers remained classified. Their contribution to the Allied victory in the Pacific was a closely guarded secret, in case the technique might be needed again in some future conflict. Only in 1968 was the program declassified, and the nation finally began to recognize and honor the service of these quiet, humble, and astonishingly effective warriors. Their story is a powerful testament to the fact that the most secure codes are not always the products of advanced mathematics and complex machinery. Sometimes they are rooted in the deep living traditions of a culture and a language that the enemy simply cannot fathom. Part 5. The Cold War. The Long, Dark Peace. The Spy Who Came In from the Cold. Ideology and Betrayal. When the guns of the Second World War fell silent in 1945, the world did not enter an era of true peace. Instead, it slid almost immediately into a new kind of conflict. A Cold War, a decades-long global struggle between the two emergent superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. This was a war fought not primarily with armies on battlefields, but with spies in the shadows, with propaganda on the airwaves, and with the terrifying, ever-present threat of nuclear annihilation. The intelligence services of both sides, the American Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, and the Soviet Committee for State Security, the KGB, grew into vast, shadowy bureaucracies, employing tens of thousands of people and spending billions of dollars in a ceaseless, clandestine contest for information and advantage. This period saw the rise of a new kind of spy, one driven not just by money or patriotism, but by a complex and often tortured web of ideological conviction. The early Cold War, in particular, was marked by a series of devastating penetrations of Western intelligence and government institutions by Soviet agents who were motivated by a sincere belief in the ideals of communism or a deep disillusionment with the inequalities and hypocrisies of Western capitalism. These were the moles, agents who burrowed deep into the fabric of the target society and betrayed it from within over the course of years or even decades. One of the most famous and damaging of these ideological spies was a group known as the Cambridge Five. These were 5 young, brilliant, and privileged men who met and were radicalized while studying at the University of Cambridge in England during the 1930s. Among the most notable members of the spy ring were Kim Philby and several other Cambridge-educated British officials who secretly worked for Soviet intelligence. All of them were recruited by Soviet intelligence, and, over the following decades, all of them rose to positions of significant trust and influence within the British establishment. Kim Philby became a high-ranking officer in MI6, the British Secret Intelligence Service, and was even, at one point, the head of the section responsible for anti-Soviet operations. He was also the chief liaison officer between MI6 and the CIA in Washington. All the while, he was passing every secret he could lay his hands on to his Soviet handlers. The damage inflicted by the Cambridge Five was catastrophic. They revealed the identities of countless Western agents operating behind the Iron Curtain, many of whom were subsequently captured and executed. They compromised major intelligence operations and undermined Western diplomacy for over 2 decades. Philby, in particular, was a master of deception, charming and convivial, able to deflect suspicion for years, even as the evidence mounted around him. He was finally exposed and fled to Moscow in 1963, where he lived out the rest of his life as a Soviet propaganda asset. The betrayal of the Cambridge Five created a deep, lasting, and corrosive sense of paranoia within Western intelligence services. If these men, the very pillars of the British upper class, could be secret communists and traitors, then who could be trusted? The most damaging mole, the greed and betrayal of Aldrich Ames. If the Cambridge Five were driven by ideology, the most damaging mole in the history of American intelligence was driven by a much older and simpler motive: greed. His name was Aldrich Hazen Ames, and his betrayal of the CIA during the 1980s and early 1990s was a catastrophe of staggering proportions, a wound from which American human intelligence operations in the Soviet Union have never fully recovered. Aldrich Rick Ames was, on the surface, an unlikely candidate for the most destructive traitor in American history. He was a career CIA officer, the son of a CIA officer. He had spent his entire adult life in the service of the agency. He was not a charismatic figure or a brilliant analyst. He was, by most accounts, a rather mediocre and unremarkable officer, struggling with financial problems and a growing sense of resentment at his stalled career. His personal life was a mess. He was drinking too much, and he was deeply in debt, partly due to his own profligate spending and partly due to the expensive tastes of his Colombian-born wife, Rosario. In April 1985, Ames walked into the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C., and volunteered his services. He didn't do it for ideology. He didn't do it because he had been blackmailed. He did it for money. He needed cash, and he knew that the one thing he had of value was his access to the innermost secrets of the CIA's operations against the Soviet Union. Over the next 9 years, Ames systematically dismantled the CIA's entire network of human sources inside the Soviet Union. He was, by his own later admission, a one-man wrecking crew. He revealed the names and identities of over 30 Soviet officials who were secretly spying for the United States, including some of the most valuable assets the CIA had ever recruited. The consequences were swift and brutal. Nearly all of the agents Ames betrayed were arrested by the KGB. Most of them were tried in secret, convicted of treason, and executed by firing squad. The CIA's ability to gather intelligence from inside the Soviet Union was effectively destroyed overnight. For years, the agency was baffled by the string of catastrophic losses. They launched mole hunts, investigated their own officers, and spun their wheels in a fog of paranoia and recrimination. All the while, Ames continued to work at CIA headquarters, meeting his Soviet handlers over lunch, leaving secret documents in dead-drop locations around Washington, and depositing large, unexplained sums of cash into his bank accounts. He bought a new Jaguar and a $500,000 house in an affluent Virginia suburb, all on a mid-level government salary, and no one, for far too long, asked the obvious questions. Ames was finally arrested in February 1994, after a joint FBI-CIA investigation finally connected the dots of his lavish lifestyle and his access to the compromised agents. Following his arrest, Ames received a life sentence after admitting to spying for the Soviet Union. The full extent of the damage he caused may never be completely known. The names of the agents he betrayed are carved on a memorial wall at CIA headquarters, a silent, permanent testament to the human cost of one man's venality. The Ames case remains a brutal, cautionary lesson in the vulnerability of even the most sophisticated intelligence organizations to the simple, corrosive power of human weakness. The Walker family spy ring, selling secrets for decades. While Aldrich Ames was destroying the CIA's network of human sources in the Soviet Union, another, even more astonishing betrayal was unfolding within the United States Navy. This was not the work of a single embittered officer, but of an entire family, the Walker family spy ring, who, for nearly 2 decades, sold some of the most sensitive military secrets of the Cold War to the Soviet Union. The ringleader was John Anthony Walker, Jr., a Navy chief warrant officer and communications specialist. In 1967, deeply in debt and disillusioned with his life, Walker walked into the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C., and offered his services. What Walker had to offer was nothing less than the keys to the kingdom of American naval communications. He had access to the cryptographic keys and technical manuals for the Navy's most secret cipher machines, including the KL-47 and the KW-7. These were the machines used to encrypt the Navy's most sensitive operational messages. With the materials Walker provided, the Soviet Union was able to read a vast portion of American naval communications traffic for almost 20 years. But Walker did not stop there. He turned his espionage into a family business. He recruited his brother, Arthur Walker, a retired Navy lieutenant commander who worked for a defense contractor. He recruited his best friend, Jerry Whitworth, a Navy radio man with access to even more classified materials, and, most chillingly, he recruited his own son, Michael Walker, a young Navy seaman stationed on the aircraft carrier USS Nimitz. He groomed his son for espionage from a young age, indoctrinating him into a worldview in which loyalty to the state was a sucker's game, and the only thing that mattered was getting paid. The secrets the Walker ring provided to the Soviets were of incalculable value. During the tense years of the late Cold War, when American and Soviet naval forces played a constant, high-stakes game of cat and mouse in the world's oceans, the Soviets knew where American submarines were operating and what their orders were. In the event of a war, this information would have allowed the Soviet Navy to target and destroy American carrier battle groups and missile submarines with devastating efficiency. The head of the KGB's American operations later stated that the Walker spy ring was the most important and damaging espionage operation the KGB ever ran against the United States. The Walker ring was finally exposed in 1985, not through brilliant counterintelligence work, but through the same personal weakness that had created it, a messy family dispute. John Walker's ex-wife, Barbara, who had known about his spying for years, finally went to the FBI, motivated by a combination of bitterness, fear for her son, and a flicker of patriotic conscience. The FBI investigation that followed led to the arrest of John Walker, his son Michael, his brother Arthur, and his friend Jerry Whitworth. All were convicted of espionage and sentenced to long prison terms. John Walker died in federal prison in 2014. The Walker case is a dark and unsettling story of how the Cold War turned ordinary Americans, a Navy chief, a radio man, a teenager on an aircraft carrier, into traitors, and of how the most secure technical systems in the world can be utterly undone by the human beings entrusted to operate them. The Farewell Dossier, a technological counterstroke. The story of Cold War espionage is not simply a one-sided litany of Soviet successes and Western failures. There were moments when the tide of intelligence turned decisively in the other direction. One of the most remarkable and consequential of these moments came in the early 1980s, in the form of a French intelligence operation that delivered a devastating blow to the Soviet Union's technological and industrial base. The operation centered around a man known only by his code name, Farewell. Farewell was a senior officer in the KGB's Directorate T, the department responsible for scientific and technical intelligence. In the spring of 1981, he approached French intelligence and offered his services. He was not motivated by money or ideology in a simple sense. He was, by all accounts, a deeply disillusioned man who had come to believe that the Soviet system he served was corrupt, inefficient, and doomed. He wanted to help bring it down. For nearly 2 years, Farewell provided his French handlers with a torrent of incredibly valuable information. The centerpiece of what became known as the Farewell Dossier was a detailed list of the Soviet Union's shopping list for Western technology. It revealed the names and specifications of thousands of high-tech components, advanced computer chips, precision machine tools, sophisticated software, sensitive radar equipment that Soviet intelligence operatives were actively trying to acquire, both legally and illegally, from Western companies. The dossier exposed the full scale of the Soviet Union's dependence on stolen and smuggled Western technology to prop up its lagging military and industrial sectors. When the French shared the Farewell dossier with the CIA, it triggered a major, multi-year counterintelligence operation. The Americans, working with their allies, did not simply block the Soviet acquisition efforts. They decided on a more subtle and devastating course of action. They allowed the Soviets to continue acquiring certain items, but they quietly arranged for those items to be subtly sabotaged. Faulty computer chips were allowed to fall into Soviet hands, chips that would pass initial inspection but fail catastrophically under stress. Flawed software was provided, software containing hidden backdoors and vulnerabilities. Altered blueprints and design specifications were passed along. The results were catastrophic for the Soviet Union. A massive new Siberian natural gas pipeline, intended to earn hard currency for the Soviet state, suffered a colossal explosion in 1982, an explosion that was detected by American satellites and is believed to have been caused by sabotage control software from the Farewell operation. More broadly, the Farewell dossier exposed the systemic weakness and technological backwardness of the Soviet economy. It provided hard evidence to Western leaders, particularly President Ronald Reagan, that the Soviet Union was not the fearsome technological equal it pretended to be, but a hollow giant dependent on Western innovation to survive. The Farewell operation was a masterpiece of counterintelligence, turning an enemy's own intelligence-gathering efforts into a weapon against him. The fate of the agent known as Farewell remains a mystery. French intelligence successfully exfiltrated him and his family to the West in 1983, and he was given a new identity. His true name has never been publicly revealed. He remains one of the great unsung heroes of the Cold War. Part 6. The Digital Age and Beyond. The Whistleblower and the Snowden Revelations. As the 20th century gave way to the 21st, the world of espionage underwent a transformation as profound as the shift from parchment to paper, or from the horse-drawn courier to the telegraph. The digital revolution, the rise of the Internet, the proliferation of personal computers, and the explosion of electronic communication created an entirely new battle space for the war of information. Governments, particularly the United States and its allies, developed vast, secret programs of electronic surveillance designed to vacuum up immense quantities of data from the global flow of digital communication. This new world of digital espionage, conducted largely in secret and on a scale that dwarfed anything that had come before, was abruptly and controversially exposed to the light of public scrutiny by a single individual, a young computer systems administrator named Edward Snowden. In 2013, Snowden, who was working as a contractor for the National Security Agency, NSA, the United States' premier signals intelligence organization, fled to Hong Kong with a massive trove of classified documents. He then arranged to meet with a group of hand-picked journalists to whom he leaked a carefully curated selection of the documents. The resulting revelations, published in The Guardian and The Washington Post, sent seismic shockwaves through the global political landscape. The world learned, in granular and often alarming detail, about the existence of programs with innocuous-sounding names like PRISM and Upstream. These programs, the documents revealed, allowed the NSA, with the compelled cooperation of major American technology companies and telecommunications providers, to collect and analyze vast quantities of internet traffic, email metadata, and other forms of digital communication. The scope of the surveillance was breathtaking. It was not targeted solely at suspected terrorists or foreign spies. It was, in many cases, a form of bulk collection, sweeping up the digital communications of millions of ordinary people around the world, including American citizens. The Snowden revelations ignited a furious global debate about the proper balance between national security and individual privacy in the digital age. To his supporters, Snowden was a heroic whistleblower, a man of conscience who had risked his freedom to expose what he saw as a vast, secret, and unconstitutional system of mass surveillance. He had, in their view, performed a vital public service by sparking a necessary and long overdue conversation about the power of the surveillance state. To his detractors, including the United States government, which charged him with espionage and theft of government property, he was a traitor and a narcissist who had recklessly compromised vital national security programs and handed a propaganda victory to America's adversaries. Snowden, granted asylum in Russia, remains a deeply polarizing figure, a fugitive from American justice, and a symbol of the profound ethical and political challenges posed by the age of digital intelligence. The algorithmic spy, artificial intelligence, and the future of secrecy. The Snowden era was, in many ways, the first chapter of a new and still unfolding story. The sheer volume of data flowing through the world's digital networks has long since outstripped the capacity of any human analyst, or even any team of human analysts, to process it. The modern intelligence agency is drowning in data. The challenge is no longer just about collecting the secret message. It is about finding the meaningful signal hidden within the overwhelming ocean of noise. The future of espionage and codes, therefore, belongs to the algorithm. It belongs to artificial intelligence. Intelligence agencies around the world are now investing heavily in AI and machine learning systems designed to sift through the vast haystacks of digital data, looking for the proverbial needles. An AI system can monitor millions of social media posts, financial transactions, travel records, and satellite images simultaneously, looking for subtle patterns and anomalies that would be invisible to a human observer. It can detect the faint, early tremors of a terrorist plot, track the movements of a suspected spy across a global network of cities, or identify a new type of malware before it has even been formally classified. On the other side of the coin, AI is also being used to create new and more robust forms of encryption, algorithms that can generate and manage cryptographic keys of such complexity that they would be effectively unbreakable, even by other AI systems. At the same time, AI is being weaponized for disinformation, creating deepfake videos and audio recordings that are indistinguishable from reality, a new and potent form of psychological warfare that can erode trust in institutions and sow chaos in democratic societies. On the far horizon looms an even more fundamental disruption, the development of quantum computing. A sufficiently powerful quantum computer, which operates on the bizarre principles of quantum mechanics rather than classical physics, would be able to break many of the public key encryption algorithms that currently secure the vast majority of the world's digital communications and financial transactions. The codes that protect our online banking, our private emails, and our state secrets would become instantly vulnerable. This prospect has triggered a global race to develop post-quantum cryptography, new forms of encryption that are resistant to attack by both classical and quantum computers. The outcome of this race will determine the future of digital security and privacy for decades to come. Epilogue: The Eternal Game. And so, the story comes full circle, returning to that blank piece of paper and the mystery of what might be hidden within or beneath its surface. We have traveled an immense distance, from the shaved head of a Greek servant in the court of a Persian king, to the humming, climate-controlled server farms of the modern intelligence agency. The tools have changed beyond all recognition. The scale of the enterprise has expanded from the personal and the local to the global and the industrial. Yet, At its core, the fundamental human drama of espionage remains stubbornly, fascinatingly unchanged. It is still a contest of wits, a battle of intellect and nerve between those who possess a secret and those who are determined to discover it. It is still a story of trust and betrayal, of courage and cowardice, of brilliant insight and catastrophic human error. The history of espionage and codes is not merely a collection of thrilling anecdotes about colorful rogues and ingenious gadgets. It is the secret history of power itself. It is the invisible architecture upon which the visible world of nations and empires has always been built. It is the reason the battle was won, the treaty was signed, the spy was caught, and the secret remained, for a time, hidden in the shadows. The game goes on, as it has for thousands of years. It is a game without end. And somewhere, right now, in a quiet room, someone is trying to hide a message, and someone else is trying to read it. The shadows are listening. We've reached the end. Thanks for listening all the way through. This was the History of Espionage and Codes, presented by Steve Buttercup III. If you enjoyed the essay, a like or subscribe helps greatly, and if there was a particular story, figure, or moment that stood out to you, feel free to leave a comment. I'm also putting together more long-form audiobooks and historical essays that will be released on Spotify over the next few months. If you're a Spotify Premium member, you can listen there for free, and if you choose to support the work directly, it's appreciated. If you're interested in history involving espionage, political power, covert operations, strange historical events, and uncomfortable parallels to the present, you can also find me on X, formerly Twitter. Thanks again for listening.